I'm Jodie Mollison. I'm the Principal Officer of Catholic Care Adoption Services.
Hi, I'm Penny Haskins. I'm a social worker in private practice specialising in adoption and all kinds of other alternate care for children.
I'm Joanne Wiles and I'm also in private practice specialising in adoption, both in assessment and training.
And I'm Carmen Fife and I'm the Program Manager, Adoption from Out of Home Care, Anglicare Sydney.
Well, look, I think they're in a sense one and the same thing, but there's been a kind of historical divide between life story work, which is kind of the product, and identity, which is who someone is. And I think that life story work really are just the words that reflect or tell the identity.
Identity formation is a process, isn't
Absolutely.
it? And the needs and what goes on for children changes over time. So you've almost got to revisit some stuff to make sense of it as the child's thinking changes in a whole new way.
And I think for carers, life story work, just the product, I've got to get the book, and I'll keep all their little awards and birthday photos and contact photos. That's easy to do. But the talking around it, the narrative, and linking that into the why am I here? Why was I born in that family? What happened in that family that meant I wasn't safe? What words do you use? How do you do that? And that's really a carer's job. So they're very happy to do the life story work often because it's kind of straightforward. But talking about it involves a whole different level of engagement for carers typically, and that's where it gets tricky. There's all this concentration in this work on what went wrong, what they did, what went wrong, because that's why the child isn't there, that why, really important. But in fact, identity is about being part of that family. You know, did their parent, were they good at school? Were they good at sport? What was their favourite colour? What was grandma do? You know, all those other things that are not about what went wrong, but are part of a broader picture of all the things that have gone to make this child up, you know. And that's where we get stuck, because often it is so shocking, and so carers are kind of, and caseworkers are often very involved in that what went wrong, and so they have very strong feelings too. And for birth family, they're so used to being kind of beaten around by what went wrong that to get them to see past that and to see that they might be able to engage in helping a child have an understanding of the whole family and what it was like totally, that's a very positive thing for a birth parent to do. But they're so used to being kind of beaten about because everyone's only interested in what they've got done wrong.
That's right.
If that makes sense.
And they are expecting the worst. When they get a call from us or they have a request from us to meet and have a chat, they're expecting to be grilled, they're expecting the worst.
Yeah.
But for us to be able to think outside the square and, you know, go to them in a sense and talk about the good stuff, the good and the great things that have happened in their, not just their lives, but in their family history as well, with our Aboriginal children and families, you know, talking to grandma, talking to auntie and uncle about, you know, those oral stories that often aren't passed down to children when they're in care because there's been that separation. So being able to be part of that conversation, facilitate some of that discussion with the child, would, you know, is a good
Fantastic.
thing.
And how often too, as a worker in this area, do you see the likenesses between children and their birth families? It might be physical likeness, it might be a mannerism, it's just kind of eerie sometimes. And so it's about celebrating those.
It's about caseworkers working with carers around valuing that information
absolutely.
and valuing where that child has come from and valuing their history and how they've moved from one family into another family. So first of all, it's valuing that this is actually an important part of who that child is, and that going into care isn't going to change who, you know, it will give them other experiences and another form of identity, but it's not going to change where they've come from and who they've brought with them into that placement. And then the second part is working with carers around their attitudes, not only to the information, but more importantly to where that information comes from, which is the birth family.
an illustration of what Josie said. I was at a kind of difficult contact last week, and the birth parents were there providing, it was a birthday party, so they were getting it all ready when I arrived. And then when the children arrived, and they all worked in, they sort of skipped in, they were pleased to be there. And the carers came, and they didn't make eye contact at all, and they didn't say hello. And I just thought, how have we... Yeah, how can you value? How can a child value this experience when there's just such kind of? It was just like it was rude, actually, cold and rude. And I thought, you know, and it doesn't matter what you say. That's what you remember. So that's the value, isn't it?
That's right.
And I know we're talking about adoption, but in essence, long-term foster care.
Exactly the same.
Principles
Exactly
should
the
apply.
same. Exactly the same.
Attitudes are often a huge barrier to adoption from out-of-home care. So any child in foster care, but certainly a child in long-term care, we'd be looking for those same attitudes, that level of kindness, the empathy, the family photos throughout the house, knowing that conversations about birth family are not taboo. We should be looking for that in foster care.
Absolutely.
And then if that should progress to adoption in the future, that's great.
And sometimes carers need to be supported with that. You know, sometimes it's hard for them to develop because they think that having those harsh judgmental attitudes are actually protective.
Yes.
You know, and sometimes to be able to move on to seeing things in a bit of a different way, in a more valued sort of a way, sometimes there needs to be a shift. But I think people can be supported through that. And sometimes being given information about, you know, who that person was, who the child's birth family was when they were 10, when they were 15, when they were 20, before the drugs, before the mental health issues.
As a caseworker, when you're doing this work, you're building relationships with everybody who's been touched by this adoption or this permanent placement. And sometimes for birth parents, it might be the first time that somebody's actually said to them, you still have a really important role in your child's life if you want to. And right now, you might not want that, but at any time, if you do, you can. And you know, I'd really like to know why you named your child that name. What happened around the time that they were born? What were things that you remember that stick in your mind that were really, like, to be asked those questions? Because they're the kinds of questions that kids ask, don't they? You know, what was it like?
And it's kind of normal. That's what you do in a normal relationship.
That process in itself has the potential to be healing and empowering and enabling for parents to go, maybe. You know, because it's really hard to move on from that grief and anger place that parents often will be when the decision's been made.
And the shame. The shame is so powerful.
Bringing the carers along in that process as well. And it's kind of how we enable carers to move from I can protect, but I can also put my arms around and embrace who this child is and the family.
That
It does
sometimes
take time. We're asking ourselves to be reflective about, am I holding on to something that's from a past time that in fact doesn't reflect what's going on now? And having the humility in a way to do that, but that then enables us, I think, as workers to go to that place of saying, where are carers at and what are they holding that may be from the past and how can we bring them
or their own experiences
forward?
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think we really need to look at in all this is actually how we do contact with each other, with family. So typically it's at an office, it's in a room, it's hopeless. We don't ever do normal stuff like I really like to have a meal. Because actually that's what normal people do, they meet for a meal. So I think it's great for caseworkers to say to birth parents, I'll take you out to lunch. Let's go and have
a picnic.
You know, just so look at doing some just normal stuff. And mixing it up a bit, you know, and doing stuff, and maybe having the carers and the birth parents having dinner together, having morning or afternoon tea, you know, just doing normal stuff, because that then it kind of starts to crack away the kind of formal way that everybody has often, particularly caseworkers and birth parents. You know, I think it could be a real addition to how we look at doing it. Every child, and this applies to kids who have any kind of complex family arrangement that isn't biological mum and biological dad, they need to sit underneath the family umbrella. And that family umbrella is comprised of all the people who make up that child's family. So their carers, family, and their birth family. And children need to sit underneath that and not take responsibility for the bits of the umbrella, you know. And I think that if the parents, all the adults in that child's life, get their act together, and that includes caseworkers, absolutely it does, then in fact a kid can just see that they're not responsible. And so if you're not responsible for the bits, you can relax into the bits, and these become all the bits that are me, without thinking, well, that bit is a bit, I don't know where that bit fits in. It just is, you know. So it really is, in my opinion, a child's identity is in a sense the responsibility of all the adults, and that includes agencies and workers.
An adopted child, they're more than being adopted. You know, that's a part of who they are. And that's
but it should
not,
never be
it's
the most
not
important
who it's not all of who they are. And I think the other thing is, by using a term like that, it has a connotation of, well, you know, this is who you are. You know, that you've now got an adoptive identity, but it negates the birth family identity. In fact, it has to include both. The child is a product of both those families.
To me, it's about integration, and that's the hardest part that I think kids have to do, in a sense, in that identity process, is how do I integrate all these different parts of me? And I get all of the reasons why it's hard, but when you're in that space, people are people. They're not that list of awful things that you saw on that report.
And you know what? If you want to do this well, you actually, as the adult, the carer, needs to get over that stuff, because this is a gift you give your child. So there's no point in having the child if you're not going to give it the gift of not having to worry about this.
The carer needs to take that responsibility, because often they're more adult than the birth family.
Yes.
And, you know, because of the circumstances that birth family sometimes find themselves in, often don't have the resources or the skills or the experience to manage things in a more adult way. And the carer, you know, puts extra burden on them. But we're asking them to, you know, maybe that needs to be asked from them right at the beginning, you know, to be the parent. And sometimes it's being the parent of the birth family as well, or taking the management role of that.
Well, we would expect them to have more competencies.
Yes.
We do.
That's
and
right.
I think in amongst the contact, particularly as a child grows and develops, we need to hear their voice shine through. So when young people are saying to us, I really like my dad to, you know, come and watch me play soccer, or I'd really like my mum to see me graduate from high school, or whatever it might be, then we need to hear that and work together as a team to see, is that possible? And caseworkers can go along to contact, but why are we there? Are we there to facilitate discussion? Are we there because there is risk? Why are we there? So I think as a caseworker, understanding what the purpose is. We know why contact's important, but what is your role at contact? Do you really need to be there at all? I think sometimes we need to test that.
It should be a really living thing, shouldn't it? It should change all the time.
And maybe it's a facilitator of the exchange between the parties, helping them work out how their relationship's going to work.
The sooner we involve carers in the contact, and that that kids aren't driven by somebody that they may or may not know to contact, and it's supervised by somebody that they may or may not know. The sooner we move from that to carers being able to be encouraged to be involved in that in a way that they feel comfortable with it, the better we kind of have a sense of what the rules are about contact, but sometimes our families don't.
No, we expect them to get
know
it.
and to get it. So kind of enabling them to know this is how it's going to run and this is what it's going to be like, and if this happens, how would you feel about that? Or is there something that you'd like to give or share, or something that you want to say?
By involving the carer, like you said, right, very early on in the piece, it actually increases the value of contact, because the child then has somebody to talk about it with in between, and you're building a memory within the, whether it's the long-term foster family or the adoptive family, you're creating another memory within that around the birth family.
The contact is about how you support and enable and encourage the relationship to continue between the child and their parent. You wouldn't have to do that if the child was with the two parents that they were born to. Their identity and the stories and how they fit and who they are just develops organically. That can't happen in that way anymore. That's
the other thing is, it gives the child and the carer first-hand experience, and in adolescence that's priceless, because the child in adolescence isn't going to be interested in the book, they're not going to be interested in the carer's story, they need to know firsthand.
And the other thing about contact is that it challenges, it challenges fantasy. I mean, kids all have fantasies about what happened and what it was like and why, and contact is the best way of challenging fantasies and of anchoring a child's understanding in reality. I think that's really kind of important.
I think if we're talking about contact, we should also highlight that for a lot of our children in care, there are siblings.
Absolutely.
Spread across the country sometimes. Some are in care, some are at home, some are adults. We, as caseworkers, need to work really, really hard to make those connections, to get contact established if it hasn't been established, and find all those siblings, and find mum and dad and grandma and all those other significant people in a child's life, because whilst they are in care, we have the opportunity to do that. Once an adoption order is made, it's harder and harder for that to be facilitated by anyone other than the adoptive parent. So we want to make those links and connections as early as possible.
And young people often talk about that what has happened to the siblings and their relationship with the siblings, I've heard this said so many times, is more important than birth parents, and so that's a really good point about.
And also because of the nature of the life that's lived by a lot of birth family, sometimes it's short-lived actually, or destroyed a bit by mental illness or drugs and alcohol or domestic violence or all those things we know about. And so sibling relationships become even more important when the adult, the parental relationships may be fractured for all kinds of other reasons.
And extended family.
Yeah.
We often forget about grandparents who have probably a longer history of the birth parents, and they've got all those childhood memories and teenage memories and the family tree stuff.
One of the fears that I think caseworkers and some carers can have is that by having contact or being involved in contact is going to create loyalty issues for the child, or it may mean that their relationship with the child might be destabilised, and that would be the last thing that they would want. And yet the interesting things that have come out of the research that Elspeth Neal's been doing, interviewing carers, adoptive parents, kids, and she's interviewed them as in primary school, high school, and now is doing the interviews with the adults. And the theme that is coming out is that their carers or their adoptive parents, having been part of contact and involved in that, actually much more strongly solidifies their place in their carer family.
Yeah. If the families value it, then they'll promote it.
Yes.
And so I think part of that's training, starting right back at the beginning, helping carers understand the value and the importance of it and how it does. Because if if carers value it, then they'll promote it, but then they don't feel threatened.
That's
Because the destabilising comes from the feeling of being threatened.
Yes.
And look, I also think as part of this, workers have to be prepared to have difficult conversations with birth family, particularly the early time, and the conversation needs to be, look, we're working to restoration or we're not, whatever the case may be. That doesn't mean that you won't have an ongoing relationship with your child. But in order to do that, it's important that you don't whisper in their ear, I'm going to get you back tomorrow. And all the things that we know happen that destabilise and that in a sense really up the ante for everybody. You know, that sort of
boundaries.
Lots of boundaries. And having the conversations and encouraging, I guess through expectation and respect of their capacity to have a positive relationship with that child. And I'm not sure that we do that enough. You know, sometimes I think supervision of contact in the early time is sort of looking and watching and always looking. And birth parents hate it. They hate it. They feel they're being spied upon. And, you know, and so it's about helping them to sort out how they can move to and engage in a way that's positive and meaningful. I think you can do that. And I think we should be trying to do that from the moment a child comes into care. The moment it comes into care. Even if it's, you know, it's been removed and as soon as it goes into a short-term situation, you know, where we're looking at restoration, okay, you need to have a relationship with these carers because that's going to be part of you demonstrating that actually you're going to be able to be an appropriate parent to your child by putting aside some jealousies and anger you feel and having a relationship that's appropriate for your child. Big tip for the Children's Court, for instance, if you're looking at restoration. So having those clear conversations.
I think as workers also, you know, caseworkers should tap into the resources that they do have. So if within their own CSC or their own agency they don't have experience of supporting contact facilitated by carers from early stages, to maybe talk to another agency who perhaps progresses matters to adoption or has had some good successes around introducing contact between all the parties at an earlier stage. I also think carers like to hear stories firsthand. So if you can link your carers with other carers who've had successes in that area, I think that would be
really important.
Pretty powerful for some carers. I know even just through experience where there's been reluctance for children to, you know, on their part not wanting to go to contact, where we've had great success where the carers go to contact.
Absolutely.
The young person stays home, they go and have a fabulous time. Get on board with the idea that not all parents are risky parents, regardless of their history. When we're doing our risk assessments, when we're talking about the exchange of information, it needs to be current and relevant. We need to be able to analyse, okay, there might be a history there, but how does that history really pose a risk to our carers or our young people? So being critical in our analysis when we're talking about risk. And then I think finally for managers and supervisors, you need to, you know, we all need to have that level of knowledge where we're able to then support our caseworkers in their decision making as well as they go forward.
I think we need to have an expectation of birth parents too. Let's hook into the functioning part of some of these people who have minimal functioning in other areas. Let's try and hook into it from the word go, you know. I think that can make a material difference in the outcomes we get from people who are often marginalised. Their experience of life is at the margins. So let's hook into what is still functioning right from the word go.
Part of that is it's more than we talk about having understanding, but in a sense it's actually understanding the birth parent, understanding that their medication that they take for their mental illness means that they're not great before midday and contact should be planned at a different time.
But if they have their injections fortnightly, earlier in that fortnightly cycle is better
Not
than
the day before they do.
Exactly.
And even the methadone, when they're getting their methadone, when's the best time of day? And often that's not considered at all. The other thing I think we haven't really talked about, which I think is really important, is those children who are placed in families of a different cultural heritage. And those families, you know, the birth family's got heaps to offer there. because if the family's not of that cultural heritage, they're not going to be able to teach their child what it means to be Polynesian or Asian or Aboriginal or whatever. But birth family, whether it's, you know, quite close or whether it's even extended family members, they can do that, and they can do that really nicely and well and not in an artificial way. Whereas I sometimes feel carers, the only way they can do it is artificially. And so I think that's another really important way of valuing the birth families around cultural issues.
As workers, we often will have conversations with carers who are concerned that the child will have a different surname when they go to school, who would like to add a name in the early stages of a child being in placement, or change a name, or have a child legally known as their surname. I think we need to give weight to the significance of the child's name and celebrate that as part of their
including
identity.
Their surname.
That's right. Their surname is huge, and they should be supported to be loud and proud of all their names. And we should be able to support our carers to do that as well. When we're talking about adoption, there's certainly, you know, within the legislation, there may be an opportunity to change a child's name through the making of an adoption order. It's a long way down the track. The preceding years need to be about solidifying that child's identity, which includes all of their names.
How many kids actually, when it comes to the time, if it does come to the time for adoption for them, will actually choose to have part of their birth family name in their name when it's changed?
Most
And
kids I work with, they want all of it. They actually want to keep it all and then add on the adoptive family name. But then I find that the adolescent kids I work with, who've always known themselves by their birth name, won't change it. And I think that says a lot, because it says, when I've talked to them about intent, they've talked about, well, that's who I am. You know, that's who I was born. That's who I am. Why would I change my name? And it sometimes worries me. It's something that you said, that when carers want to change their name, the name of the child, you know, going to school or whatever, I feel like they're hiding behind, you know, the carer's name in a way, or hiding behind that they don't have to be public about it. And look, I can understand that children don't want to be seen as different, and they don't want to highlight that they're in foster care. But it can be managed in a positive way, and like you said, lots of families have different names. And you've just got to be really careful that it's not used as a tool to hide the child's identity.
Absolutely. You can understand a child who perhaps has had 5 or 6 or 7 placements and has come into a placement at 8 or 9 and then goes on to be adopted, and really wanting that name change as a symbol of, I'm not going anywhere else. But those kids are rare.
Well, they're starting to be. It's just the shift I've noticed in the last few years, that lots of children want to keep their whole name and then tack on. And these are 7, 8-year-olds that are saying this. And then the adolescents who say, no, I don't want to change it. So that seems to be shifting. And so whether there is some good work going on with those children and carers, and that's the result of it.
Is that actually about a more integrated identity?
I think so.
Is it more about not having to choose between one family or another? There's some kind of blend that they've been able to establish
Accommodate,
that they are okay enough with, and probably their parents in the broader sense of the word.
It's also happened in, for instance, the inter-country adoption community, where children's names were always changed. And increasingly now they're absolutely not. So it's been an interesting historical change over the last 20 years that Jo and I have been doing it. You know, kids' names just now don't change. And so there is some historical, and you know, like it's more contemporary now for children's names not to change. So it's probably a bit of both those things.
Yeah. So maybe we have started that shift.
Maybe we have.
We've already started that.
The other theme that keeps coming up is a theme about difference and how we manage difference. At some point in our lives, we all have experiences of feeling different and what that was like. And I think if we're all mindful of that as carers and as workers around what was it like for me to feel different, and what was that like, and what was helpful or not helpful for me in that process. Because if carers can draw on that for kids, they're going to have more empathy.
Even just the term foster child care, or being in foster care, or being an adopted child, or it's back to our community hasn't quite got there yet in valuing different families. We're not there yet, and that's part of, I suppose, the role of caseworkers and carers is still valuing that. Like, it's okay. Like, it's painful, it's hard, but it's actually okay, and to be able to not be proud of being a foster child or an adopted child, but somehow making it okay, and that part of your identity, doesn't have to be negated. It's just is, it just is, and that's okay.